So hopefully by now we have an understanding of what intervals are in a general sense, and in terms of generic intervals, how the letters kind of interact with each other. Now we'll expand the conversation to talk about specific intervals. Now it is going to matter whether it's a flat or a sharp or a natural, because it's going to impact how we label the interval. So generic intervals become specific intervals when we start to clarify the quality of those numeric distances. So for example, not just any kind of second, but what kind of second? Not just any kind of fourth, but what kind of fourth? We answer that question by using what we call qualities. The qualities that can apply to intervals include major, minor, diminished, augmented, and perfect. Now, not all of the intervals can take on all of these qualities. Major and minor qualities can only apply to seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. Perfect qualities can only apply to unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves. So for example, with major and minor, there's no such thing as a major fifth. There's no such thing as a minor unison. In terms of perfects, there's no such thing as a perfect seventh or a perfect third. The qualities that float around a bit more freely are the diminished intervals and the augmented intervals. Now, these aren't as common as the majors, minors, and perfects, but they are possible with any numeric or generic interval. Perhaps one of the simplest ways to get an early handle on labeling intervals is to count those intervals in terms of half steps. Let's go back to our A compared to another A. When we talked about generic intervals, we said that any kind of A to any kind of A within the same octave constituted some kind of unison. Well, if both of those A's are A flat within the same octave, from one A to the next constitutes a motion of 0 half steps. 0 half steps with notes that are named with the same letter constitute a perfect unison. Now, if we were to go up from that A half step, from A to B flat, we know that some kind of A up to some kind of B is some kind of second. And in terms of specifying the interval, moving up from an A natural to a B flat is a motion of 1 half step, which we associate with not just any kind of second, but a minor second. Similarly, if we go down from A to a G sharp, we know from generic intervals that A down to G is some kind of second, but because it's a motion of 1 half step, we can say that we're moving down a minor second. So assuming that we changed letters, so to speak, or changed positions on the staff, if we go up or down by a half step to the next adjacent space or line, or to the next adjacent letter, if you think about it alphabetically, that is a minor second. If you travel from an A down to a D, we know from generic intervals that that constitutes a motion downward of a fifth of some kind. But if it's an A natural down to a D natural, well, that distance of 7 half steps makes it a perfect fifth. Similarly, I can go up a perfect fifth from A as well. If I go up from A natural to E natural, that's still 7 half steps from A to an E, so some kind of fifth. So this time you've gone up a perfect fifth. In Canvas, I've provided a document that lists the common intervals by number of half steps. In addition to the common interval labels, you'll see another column that lists several enharmonic equivalent labels. The reason that's important is because we're at the point where spelling does begin to count. As I said, if you proceed up a half step from A and change a letter name to B flat, then and only then can we call that some kind of second. However, if you go from an A up a half step and instead label the note A sharp, well, remember, generic intervals tells us that an A to another A in the same octave is some kind of unison. So since we're not changing letters, we can't label it the same way we would a minor second. Instead, the note naming requires that we label this an augmented unison. As explained earlier, the major and minor qualities can only ever apply to a subset of our numeric intervals. The perfect quality can only apply to a different subset of intervals. However, both the augmented quality and the diminished quality could each be applied to any of our generic intervals. Let's go ahead and explore then a bit of what augmented and diminished actually mean. Basically, an augmented interval is an interval that's taken and stretched an extra half step beyond its either major form or perfect form. Remember, only certain intervals could ever be major, the second, the third, the sixth, the seventh, and only certain intervals can ever be perfect, the unison, the fourth, the fifth, and the octave. So once they reach that point, if you want to keep the letter name but increase that distance between notes by half a step, well then you've created an augmented interval. So for example, an F to a B flat, if you're going up, an F up to a B flat is a perfect fourth. However, if I take that B flat and move it up a a half step while keeping the letter B somehow attached to that note and make it a B natural? Well, it's still a fourth because it's an F up to a B. Anytime you go up from any kind of F to any kind of B, that is some kind of fourth. But it's wider than a perfect fourth, and one half step wider than a perfect fourth is an augmented fourth. Similarly, I could do the same thing by moving the F. If I start with the F up to B flat, it's still a perfect fourth, but remember, an augmented interval stretches the space. Before we talked about stretching that space by moving the upper note higher, we could also increase that space by keeping the upper note where it is and moving the lower note lower. So if I take that F and move it down a half step and still want to call it some kind of an F, remember in this case that I wouldn't call it an E then, I'd call it an F flat. B flat down to F flat, it's going to be some kind of fourth. Again, it's some kind of B down to some kind of F. But in this case, it's going to be an augmented fourth. So augmented intervals essentially represent a stretching of a major interval, just one more half step, or a perfect interval, just one more half step. So what about diminished intervals? Well, they kind of work on the other side. A diminished interval can take a minor interval and shrink it one more half step, but it can also take a perfect interval and shrink it one more half step. So let's take a minor seventh. How about E flat and D flat? I would like to maintain the generic interval of a seventh, but shrink the distance between these two notes. Remember, I can shrink the notes either by raising the lower note half a step or by dropping the upper note half a step. In either event, as long as I keep the note letters the same, I will move from a minor seventh to a diminished seventh. So if I start with the lower note, moving the E flat up half a step, that would become an E natural. So E to D flat is a diminished seventh. Or I could keep the E flat and move the D flat down a half step. Now, before I name this a C, I have to remember that I'm trying to keep the generic interval of a seventh. So rather than calling the new note a C, I'll label it a D double flat. So E flat to D double flat is a diminished seventh.